Thank you, Mayor and Council. So this evening I'm going to briefly explain some of the financial challenges that the city is addressing, talk about the actions we've taken to live within our means, and then present the recommendations of the City Council's Ad Hoc Committee on Revenue Measures to pursue a local sales tax measure that would help us to support valued city services. I'd like to particularly thank the members of the Ad Hoc Committee, and that is Council Members Aguirre and Mazer and Siebert. They provided extensive engagement and invaluable assistance over the last several months. So first, I'd like to begin by providing some brief context about the city's long history of conservative financial management. The city adheres to many financial best practices, including passing a structurally balanced each year, which doesn't use one-time money to fund ongoing services, forecasting future revenues and expenditures, establishing reserves for emergencies and future needs, and funding the repair and expansion of utilities and infrastructure. And these strong practices are recognized by our independent auditor, who reviews the city's books each year to ensure that we're accurately stating our financial position and operating within our fiscal policies. It's also recognized by independent municipal bond rating agencies, such as Moody's, which just last week assigned the city its second highest rating possible for municipal governments. This rating reflects both the vigor of our local economy and the city's efforts to be disciplined in our spending and to plan for the future. That philosophy continues today, and we're working to proactively address issues that are common across the state and the nation. On the revenue side, we are affected by trends in consumer behavior. Though downtown is a bright spot financially, generating $7 million more in property and sales tax compared to 5 years ago, revenue growth is limited by changing consumer behavior, such as residents spending more on housing or services rather than goods that are taxed, and video streaming rather than cable, reducing our utility user tax receipts. At the same time, we must make steeply increasing payments to the state pension system to fund commitments made to now retired employees. These cost increases significantly outstrip our revenue growth and threaten funding for core city services. This statewide dynamic is well documented. A League of California Cities report in January determined that city pension costs will rise dramatically to unsustainable levels for most California cities. Locally, the San Mateo County Civil Grand Jury released a report last week noting all cities in the county face very hard choices as they seek to pay off unfunded liabilities. This statewide challenge needs statewide solutions, and we are working with the League of California Cities and our legislators to achieve this. At the same time, we have to make steps locally, and that's what I'll address next. To understand what's at stake, it's important to understand what our operating budget funds. 60% of our general fund budget is dedicated to public safety and other essential city services, including after-school programs and library services. When you add together public safety, parks and recreation, and library services, it consumes 82% of our general fund. Not on this list are the city's water and sewer services, because those are funded by ratepayers, and those funds must be accounted for separately. Similarly, we have dedicated funding for major capital projects, including transportation projects, and those funds can't be used for core city services such as public safety. To ensure that we only use ongoing revenues to fund ongoing expenses, we made some hard decisions with this year's budget. Because 74% of the budget goes to employee-related expenses, and most of those are public safety, it's not possible to reduce the budget without affecting employees and therefore services. This year, the budget just adopted includes $3.7 million in reductions to every city department, including eliminating 4 vacant police officer positions, 3 vacant firefighter positions, and pursuing a shared service approach with the county for the CERT program, eliminating some of our after-school programming, reducing library staffing and hours effective next January, and reducing funding for code enforcement. It's important to know that we've taken several steps to prepare for future costs. In 2011, we negotiated with our employees to require much higher than typical employee pension contributions and a new lower pension formula for new hires. Last year, the City Council approved fee increases on development activity. But even after those steps and the cuts that I've just described, without new revenue, our only option is to continue to reduce costs, and this will affect services. Because 82% of our budget goes to police, fire, parks, recreation, and library, even those services would be reduced. Reduced staffing would affect things like how quickly we can respond to fire and paramedic and police calls for service, how well we can maintain our parks and streets, how many services we can offer to children and teens, and how many hours our libraries are open. Because we know residents value these services, last fall we began considering revenue increases to avoid cuts like these. The City Council elected to focus on a sales tax measure as a relatively modest increase, 50 cents on a $100 purchase, would generate about $8 million, the best opportunity for avoiding serious cuts to community services. In an effort to seek community input on the city's financial challenges and input on what the city should do, we embarked on an education campaign, including reaching out to registered voters, community members, and community groups, sending 2 mailers to every household requesting feedback, launching an online survey, and conducting 2 polls of likely voters. We also developed a webpage with a great deal of additional information and added and continued to add frequently asked questions as we heard inquiries from residents. In the online and mailed-in survey, we asked for other ideas on how the city could ensure a balanced budget. We did not collect demographic information for those responding to this survey, so we're not able to know how representative the feedback was. But we very much appreciate that many people spent time and a stamp to respond to the survey. In the responses, we heard support for the sales tax, and there were also several alternative approaches suggested, such as an employer tax, increased developer fees, increased economic development efforts, a parcel tax, and reducing costs and services instead of raising taxes. There are pros and cons to each of those approaches, and the City Council may wish to consider them in the future. Unfortunately, we don't have time to study them and still place an item on the November 2018 ballot. A tax measure has to go to voters for approval, and to help us assess the likelihood of voter support for a potential tax, we engaged 2 top firms, TBWB Strategies and EMC Research. And representatives from both firms are here tonight and can answer any detailed questions that you might have. EMC Research conducted a hybrid web and phone poll of likely voters in March and followed up in June to learn about support for a half-cent sales tax. Conducted in the 3rd week of June, they completed 431 interviews with an overall margin of error plus or minus 4.7 percentage points. Interviews were conducted in both English and Spanish by trained professional interviewers. Key findings from the poll. Voters continue to rate city services positively, and most say that these services are important to their quality of life. Despite some sensitivity to new taxes, 62% of likely voters indicated they'd vote in favor of a half-cent sales tax that would bring a new rate to 9.25%. The most compelling arguments, they said, were that essential purchases like groceries and medicine would be exempt from the sales tax, all new revenue would stay local and would not go to the state, and new revenue would help protect public safety, particularly police, fire, and paramedic services. Based on the significant community input that further budget cuts would have, significant community impact that further cuts would have, and the positive response from likely voters, the Revenue Measure Ad Hoc Committee and staff are recommending that the City Council endorse placing a half-cent local sales tax measure for voter consideration on the November 2018 ballot. that you would approve the necessary resolution and ordinance to do this, and that you would designate the mayor and the ad hoc committee to finalize the argument for the ballot measure. There are all alternatives to that recommendation. However, as I mentioned, because we have strict timeline constraints with the election, and we would typically do more analysis and community engagement, it is not possible to substitute another tax measure for the November 2018 ballot. So if the City Council decides not to pursue a sales tax measure, the options before you would be to direct staff to focus on cost and service reductions only in order to balance the city's budget, or to direct staff and the committee to develop alternative approaches for raising revenue for future discussion. I would note that would still require additional cost reductions in the near term. So with that, I'd be happy to turn it over to the mayor and perhaps members of the committee who may also want to make comments. Thank you.
Okay. Do any of the members of the committee, would you like to make a comment?